My entitled in-laws secretly built their massive dream home on the acreage my grandfather left me. When my husband defended their blatant theft, I smiled, called my attorney, and prepared a trap that would ruin them completely. Before we continue today's story, we have an urgent announcement to make. Due to technical issues, we are pivoting towards another channel. Please subscribe to our new channel, Kin and Karma. You can find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag on this video. Make sure to switch over now so you don't miss out. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. The fever broke on a Tuesday, leaving me a hollowed-out shell of myself, sweating through the sheets of our city apartment. I had been battling a vicious strain of pneumonia for 3 weeks. My chest felt tight, my throat felt like shattered glass, and my energy was entirely depleted. My husband, William, had been absent for most of it. He claimed he needed to spend his days out at his parents' suburban house to help them organize their garage and figure out their retirement downsizing. I had been too weak to argue, too sick to question why he was suddenly so devoted to sorting through dusty boxes, while his wife struggled to breathe across town. I was lying in the dim light of the bedroom, staring blankly at the ceiling fan, when my phone vibrated against the nightstand. The caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen in months, Mr. Henderson. He was an elderly gentleman who owned the property adjacent to the 50 acres of pristine, undeveloped woodland my grandfather had left me. That land was my sanctuary, even if I hadn't been well enough to visit it lately. I cleared my dry throat and answered. "Hello, Mr. Henderson," I rasped, my voice barely above a whisper. "Caroline, is that you? You sound terrible, dear." His gruff, familiar voice crackled through the speaker. "Listen, I didn't want to bother you, but I figured I had to call. Is there a reason you didn't tell me about the massive development project going on next door?" I frowned, pushing myself up against the pillows, a wave of dizziness washing over me. "Development project? What do you mean? The land is untouched. It's a protected trust." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. "Caroline, they've been running logging trucks down the access road for 2 weeks. Yesterday, a concrete mixer went through. I went over to the property line this morning. There is a massive, poured foundation right in the middle of the eastern clearing. A huge house is going up." My blood ran cold. The chill had nothing to do with the lingering illness. Who is building it?" "I asked the foreman," Mr. Henderson said gently. "He said the owners hired them, a nice older couple, said their names were Jaden and Delilah." The phone slipped from my sweaty palm, landing softly on the duvet. Jaden and Delilah, William's parents. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't the pneumonia suffocating me this time, it was the crushing weight of utter betrayal. My husband wasn't helping them organize a garage. He was covering for them while they illegally bulldozed the only piece of my family history I had left. The betrayal gnawed at my bones, a sickness far deeper than the one in my lungs. The hours that followed were a blur of agonizing physical pain and terrifying mental clarity. I forced myself out of bed. My legs trembled under my weight as I dragged myself to the bathroom sink, splashing cold water on my pale, sickly face. The reflection staring back at me looked fragile, but behind the dark circles under my eyes, a spark of absolute fury was igniting. I didn't call William, I waited for him. He walked through the front door around 7 in the evening, smelling faintly of sawdust and expensive takeout. He dropped his keys on the counter with a loud clatter and sighed dramatically, playing the part of the exhausted son. "Hey," he called out, not even coming into the bedroom to check on me. "Traffic was a nightmare. My parents are driving me crazy. Mom can't decide what to do with the patio furniture." I walked out of the bedroom, leaning heavily against the doorframe for support. I stared at him. "How is the foundation looking, William?" He froze. He was in the middle of taking off his jacket, and his arms stopped midair. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pasty and terrified. He slowly lowered his arms and tried to force a laugh, but it sounded like a dying engine. "Foundation? What are you talking about, Caroline? You must still have a fever." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice dangerously calm, devoid of any warmth. Mr. Henderson called. He saw the logging trucks. He saw the concrete. He spoke to the foreman who told him Jaden and Delilah are building a house on my grandfather's land. William swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room looking for an escape, when he realized there wasn't one. His posture shifted from guilty to defensive. It was a transformation I had seen many times, but never directed at something this massive. "Look, Caroline, you're overreacting," he stammered, taking a step toward me, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "They were going to surprise you. They knew you wanted to do something with that land eventually. They're just improving it. They're using their own retirement savings to build a beautiful family estate where we can all spend time together. You should be thanking them. They're increasing the property value." "They are trespassing," I stated coldly. "They are destroying protected woodland that belongs strictly to me." "It's family land now," William argued, his voice rising, annoyed that his gaslighting wasn't working. "We're married. My parents are your parents. You've been so sick, so out of it. We just took the initiative. You'll love it when it's done, I promise. Just calm down and let them finish." He turned away from me, dismissing my anger as if I were a child throwing a tantrum, and walked into the kitchen to grab a beer. He genuinely believed that because I was weak, because I was traditionally the peacekeeper in our marriage, I would simply roll over and accept this monumental violation. I watched him crack open the bottle, a cold, calculating calm settling over my racing heart. They thought I was just an ailing wife they could steamroll, but they had forgotten one crucial thing. To understand the depth of this violation, you have to understand what I gave up for William. When we met in our late 20s, I was already establishing myself as an architect, working 80-hour weeks to build my career. William was a struggling freelance illustrator drowning in credit card debt. I loved him, so I paid off his debts. I supported us entirely for 4 years while he found his artistic voice. I sacrificed my savings, my free time, and my peace of mind to ensure he felt secure. The only thing I kept entirely for myself was the 50 acres. My grandfather, a stern but deeply loving man who taught me how to read blueprints and respect the earth, left it to me in an ironclad trust before he passed. It was my sanctuary, the place I intended to build a small, eco-friendly cabin one day. Jaden and Delilah always hated that land. From the moment I met my in-laws, they made my skin crawl. Delilah was a master of the backhanded compliment. She was impeccably dressed, her hair permanently sprayed into a stiff helmet, always wearing too much expensive perfume. She would look around our modest apartment and say things like, "It's so quaint how you tolerate living in such a cramped space, Caroline. Especially when you have all that wasted dirt just sitting out in the country." Jaden was worse. He was a retired middle manager who fancied himself a real estate tycoon. He was loud, pompous, and entirely self-serving. At every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, he would corner me with a glass of scotch in his hand and aggressively pitch his vision. "You're sitting on a gold mine, little lady," he would boom, tapping his finger on the table. "Clear-cut those trees, subdivide the lots, and you could make a killing. It's irresponsible to just let it sit there. You don't know the first thing about maximizing assets. Sign it over to a joint LLC with William and me, and I'll handle the heavy lifting." I always refused, politely but firmly. I told them the land was sentimental, that it was not for sale, and it was certainly not for development. They would exchange knowing, condescending looks, treating me like a naive girl who didn't understand the real world. Now, knowing that they had bypassed my refusal, bypassed my ownership, and utilized my severe illness as an opportunity to violently carve their own desires into my grandfather's legacy, with my husband's active assistance, the picture was complete. They weren't just entitled, they were predators. They had looked at my boundaries and decided they simply didn't apply to them. They viewed my property as their right and my illness as their perfect cover. I walked slowly back to my bed, closing the door softly behind me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I opened my laptop, pulled up the contact information for the most ruthless property litigation attorney in the state, and began to draft an email. The morning light filtering through our bedroom blinds felt harsh and unforgiving. I had barely slept, my mind racing through a labyrinth of legal statutes, property lines, and the devastating reality of my marriage. The physical exhaustion of pneumonia was still present, a heavy weight sitting squarely on my chest, but it was entirely eclipsed by a cold, sharp adrenaline. I was no longer the frail, bedridden wife waiting for her husband to bring her a glass of water. I was a professional, a woman who understood the intricacies of land management better than anyone else they could have possibly crossed. My grandfather hadn't just left me the land, he had trained me to understand its value. While William believed I was merely an architect, my true specialty, the very foundation of my career before I started funding his artistic whims was land surveying and environmental compliance. I knew every square inch of those 50 acres. I knew the soil composition, the water tables, and the specific zoning laws of the county. As soon as William left for his freelance studio that morning, avoiding eye contact and muttering something about needing space to think, I dragged myself to my home office. I bypassed my drafting software and opened the heavy, fireproof safe tucked beneath my desk. Inside sat the thick, leather-bound binder containing my grandfather's irrevocable trust. I flipped to the topographical maps. The eastern clearing, where Mr. Henderson had spotted the concrete mixer, wasn't just a random spot in the woods. It was a designated wetland conservation zone. My grandfather and I had spent 2 years lobbying the county to place a strict environmental easement on that specific parcel to protect the runoff into the private lake. Building a residential structure there wasn't just frowned upon. It was a severe violation of state environmental laws, carrying massive daily fines and mandatory demolition orders at the owner's expense. Jaden and Delilah had picked the absolute worst, most illegal spot on the entire 50 acres to pour their unpermitted foundation. And because the land was in a trust that required my notarized signature for absolutely any modification, any permits they claimed to have were either entirely fabricated or obtained through blatant fraud. This was my trap. They thought they were stealing empty dirt. Instead, they had cemented themselves into a federal environmental crime. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, my laptop chimed with an incoming video call. It was Marcus Sterling, a property litigation attorney known throughout the city for dismantling corporate land grabs. I had sent him a frantic, detailed email at 3:00 a.m., attaching the trust documents and the easement filings. Marcus appeared on screen, his sharp eyes scanning his own monitor before looking at me. He was a man who did not waste time with pleasantries. "Caroline," he began, his voice crisp and steady. "I received your files. I also pulled the county permit database an hour ago. You will be interested to know that your in-laws did, in fact, file for a residential building permit." "How is that possible?" I rasped, leaning closer to the screen. "They don't own the land. The trust requires my physical signature. I've been sick in bed for a month." Marcus held up a piece of paper. They submitted a quitclaim deed to the county clerk's office, granting them a parcel of the estate. The deed bears your signature, Caroline. It was notarized 12 days ago. The room spun. 12 days ago, I was in the emergency room getting a chest x-ray for my pneumonia, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of horror and mounting rage. "I haven't signed a single document. They forged it." "Not only did they forge it," Marcus said, leaning forward, a predatory gleam in his eye, "but they filed it against a protected wetland easement. They are currently pouring concrete onto federally protected soil. If the EPA catches wind of this, the fines alone will bankrupt them before the house is even framed. But we aren't going to wait for the EPA. We are going to serve them a cease and desist, an eviction notice, and a lawsuit for fraudulent conveyance." "Do it," I said, not hesitating for a single second. "Draft it immediately. I want them off my grandfather's land by the end of the week." "I will have the injunction filed by noon," Marcus replied. "But I need you to understand something, Caroline. When people like this are cornered, they do not apologize. They escalate. You need to be prepared for the fallout, especially concerning your husband. If he is complicit in the forgery, he goes down with them. He made his choice when he lied to my face, I said, the absolute truth of the statement settling heavily into my bones. Let them escalate. I have all the time in the world. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. By Thursday afternoon, the county sheriff had delivered the formal cease and desist and the immediate stop work order to the construction site, stapling the bright orange notices directly to the wooden framing that had just started going up. Less than 2 hours later, I heard the aggressive pounding on my apartment door. I was sitting in the living room, a cup of herbal tea growing cold in my hands. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing down my sweater. I walked to the door and unlocked it. Jaden and Delilah didn't wait for an invitation. They barged past me into the narrow hallway, bringing with them the overwhelming scent of Delilah's floral perfume and Jaden's stress sweat. Delilah was clutching a ridiculously oversized Dzig. In her handbag, her face flushed red beneath her layers of makeup. Jaden looked like a pressure cooker about to explode. "What is the meaning of this, Caroline?" Jaden bellowed, waving a crumpled copy of the legal injunction in my face. His voice echoed off the apartment walls, loud enough to make the neighbors pause. "Have you completely lost your mind? You sent the police to our property." "My property, Jaden," I corrected him quietly, closing the door behind them so they couldn't make a scene in the hallway. "And I didn't send the police. I sent an officer of the court to enforce my legal rights." Delilah scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest, trying to look imposing in our small living room. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Caroline. We knew you were sick, so we took the initiative. We are building a legacy. We are increasing the value of that useless, overgrown dirt. You should be down on your knees thanking us for managing your assets while you lie around feeling sorry for yourself." "Managing my assets?" I repeated, my voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of the polite deference I had shown them for years. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up a folder Marcus had couriered to me that morning. "Is that what you call forging my signature on a quitclaim deed?" The color instantly drained from Jaden's face. His bluster faltered for a fraction of a second, his mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. Delilah's eyes darted nervously toward her husband, the confident facade cracking instantly. I don't know what you're talking about," Jaden stammered, his voice suddenly lacking its usual booming authority. "William handled the paperwork. He said you gave verbal consent. We have a legal right." "You have nothing," I interrupted, taking a step toward them, forcing them to back up against the entryway wall. "Verbal consent does not override an irrevocable trust, and it certainly does not allow you to forge my signature and get it fraudulently notarized by your golfing buddy down at the bank. I have a time-stamped hospital record proving I was strapped to a respiratory machine the day that deed was allegedly signed." "Now listen here, little lady," Jaden growled, trying to regain his footing by resorting to his old intimidation tactics. He pointed a thick, shaking finger at my face. "We have already sunk $300,000 into that foundation and the contractor deposits. That is our retirement money. We aren't going anywhere. We will tie you up in court for decades. We will sue you for the construction costs, for the improvements made to the land, for emotional distress." "You can't sue someone for improvements made while committing a felony, Jaden," I said, a cold smile finally touching my lips. "But that isn't even the best part." I pulled out the topographical map Marcus had annotated and held it up so they could see the bright red lines drawn across the eastern clearing. "You didn't just build on my land. You built squarely in the middle of a federally protected wetland conservation easement," I explained, watching their eyes widen as the words registered. "Even if I wanted to give you that land, which I do not, you cannot legally build a structure there. The county has already been notified of the environmental violation. By tomorrow, the EPA will be involved. The fines for pouring concrete into a protected watershed start at $10,000 a day. And since your names are on the fraudulent permits, those fines go directly to you." Delilah let out a high-pitched gasp, clutching her designer bag to her chest as if it could protect her. You set us up. You knew we were building there and you waited. I didn't set you up, Delilah, I said calmly, opening the front door and gesturing for them to leave. You dug your own grave. I'm just the one who refuses to be buried in it. Now get out of my apartment before I call the police for trespassing. Again. The fallout from my confrontation with Jaden and Delilah was swift and chaotic. They didn't retreat. They doubled down, thrashing like animals caught in a snare. They hired a bottom-feeding defense attorney who immediately filed a countersuit against me for $300,000, claiming unjust enrichment, arguing that their illegal, unpermitted concrete slab had somehow magically increased the value of my protected wetlands. But the real escalation came from William. 2 days after I threw his parents out, William burst into the apartment, his face pale, his hair disheveled. He looked as though he hadn't slept in a week. He practically threw his laptop onto the kitchen counter. "Caroline, you have to stop this," he pleaded, his voice cracking with panic. He ran his hands through his hair, pacing the length of the kitchen. "My dad just called. The county sent them a notice of violation. They're demanding the foundation be ripped out by the end of the month, and they've frozen my parents. Bank accounts pending an investigation into the forged notary stamp. You are going to send my father to prison." I sat at the kitchen island, meticulously reviewing a stack of financial disclosures Marcus had managed to subpoena in record time. I didn't look up immediately. I let the silence stretch, forcing William to sit with the reality of what his family had done. "I am not sending your father anywhere, William," I said evenly, turning a page. "Your father's actions are sending him to prison. I am merely refusing to be the victim of his fraud." "They're my family, Caroline," he shouted, slamming his hand against the counter, shaking the fruit bowl. "They made a mistake. They were just trying to build a place for us. You can't just destroy them over some trees and a stupid piece of paper. Call your lawyer. Tell him to drop the injunction. We can work this out. We can pay the fines together." I finally looked up at him. The man I had supported for 4 years, the man whose debts I had cleared, was standing before me demanding that I empty my own pockets to save the people who had tried to steal my inheritance while I was deathly ill. The last shred of love I held for him withered and turned to ash right then and there. "We are not paying anything together, William," I said, my voice dangerously soft. I slid one of the financial documents across the granite countertop toward him. "Because your parents didn't just use their retirement savings. Did you even bother to ask where they got $300,000 in cash to pay the contractors up front?" William frowned, looking down at the document. "My dad said he cashed in his 401k. "Your dad lied," I replied. "Your dad doesn't have a 401k. He lost most of his retirement in a bad day trading scheme 5 years ago. This document is a loan origination form from a high-interest private lender." William picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the dense text. His breathing hitched. "What is this?" "Read the collateral line, William," I instructed coldly. I watched as his eyes scanned down to the bottom of the page. I watched as the color completely vanished from his lips. I watched his entire world crumble in real time. They used my studio," William whispered, his hands beginning to shake violently. "They put a lien on my freelance business. They used my business credit line as a guarantor for a $300,000 construction loan." "Yes, they did," I confirmed, standing up from the stool. "And because the county has frozen their assets and halted the build, they have defaulted on the very first payment. That private lender is going to seize your business, William. Your parents didn't just try to steal my future. They actively destroyed yours to get what they wanted." William collapsed into one of the kitchen chairs, burying his face in his hands. He was hyperventilating, the reality of his parents' profound, calculated betrayal finally shattering the illusion he had defended for his entire life. He had been so busy protecting them from my boundaries that he hadn't realized they were actively stripping him of everything he owned. "Oh my God," he sobbed into his hands. "What have they done? What do I do, Caroline? Please, you have to help me fix this." I am fixing this, William, I said, gathering my paperwork and walking toward my home office, leaving him alone in the kitchen with the ruins of his misplaced loyalty. I'm fixing it for myself. You are going to have to figure out how to survive your own family. The stage was set. The investigation had uncovered every lie, every forged document, and every stolen dollar. There was nowhere left for Jaden and Delilah to hide, and their final desperate attempt to sue me was about to blow up in their faces in the most spectacular, public way imaginable. The county courthouse annex, where the court-mandated mediation was scheduled to take place, was a cold, sterile building that smelled faintly of floor wax and stale coffee. I arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that I hadn't worn since before the pneumonia took hold of me. I was still physically recovering, my breaths were shallow, and I leaned slightly on an umbrella for support, but mentally, I had never been stronger. My attorney, Marcus Sterling, walked beside me, carrying a thick, expandable leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of Jaden and Delilah's entire fabricated lives. We entered conference room B. It was a large, imposing space with a long mahogany table. Sitting at the far end, huddled together like cornered rats, were my in-laws and their incredibly nervous-looking defense attorney, a young man who looked like he had just graduated from law school and had no idea what kind of explosive case he had walked into. Jaden was sweating profusely, his face a mottled red. He attempted to sneer at me as I walked in, but his eyes were darting nervously to Marcus S. Heavy briefcase. Delilah was pale beneath her heavy bronzer, clutching a tissue in one hand and her ridiculous designer bag in the other. And then there was William. He sat at the opposite end of the table from his parents, looking like a ghost. He hadn't spoken to them since the day he found out about the fraudulent loan against his business. He stared blankly at the polished wood of the table, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The mediator, a stern, older woman named Judge Eris, walked in and took her seat at the head of the table. She adjusted her glasses, opened the file, and sighed. "All right," Judge Eris began, her voice commanding immediate silence. "We are here for the matter of the Trust of Caroline's estate versus Jaden and Delilah, regarding the unauthorized construction on protected property and the countersuit for $300,000 in alleged improvements. Let us begin. Counsel for the defendants, you filed the countersuit. You have the floor." The young defense attorney stood up, clearing his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. My clients acted in good faith. They were operating under the assumption of familial consent to improve the property. They have invested their life savings, totaling $300,000, to build a multi-generational home. My client, Caroline, is now attempting to unjustly enrich herself by keeping the foundation and the building materials while unfairly evicting my clients." Judge Eris looked at Marcus. "Mr. Sterling." Marcus didn't stand. He simply popped the latches on his briefcase. The click echoed loudly in the silent room. "Your Honor," Marcus said calmly, his voice a lethal instrument. "The defense's argument relies entirely on the concept of good faith. We are here today to demonstrate that not only was there no good faith, but the defendants have committed multiple felonies to facilitate this illegal construction." Marcus slid the first document across the table to the mediator and a copy to the defense attorney. "Exhibit A, the quitclaim deed filed with the county. It bears my client's signature, allegedly transferring the property to the defendants." "Yes," Jaden interrupted, unable to help himself, puffing out his chest. "She signed it. We have a notary stamp." "Exhibit B," Marcus continued, ignoring Jaden entirely and sliding a thick stack of medical records across the table. "Time-stamped, certified hospital records. On the exact date and time that notary stamp was applied, my client was strapped to a cardiac monitor and a respiratory machine in the intensive care unit on the other side of the state. She was physically incapable of signing anything. We have already submitted these documents to the district attorney's office. The notary, a personal friend of Jaden S., has already confessed to falsifying the stamp under pressure." The young defense attorney looked at the medical records, then slowly turned to stare at his clients in absolute horror. You told me she signed it in your kitchen." Delilah burst into loud, theatrical tears. "She told us we could have it. She just forgot because she was sick. We are the victims here." "You are not victims, Delilah," I spoke up, my voice cutting through her fake sobbing like a knife. I looked directly at the mediator. "But the crimes don't stop at forgery. Exhibit C, Your Honor." Marcus handed over the topographical maps and the EPA notices. The defendants did not build a home. They poured $300,000 worth of industrial concrete directly into a federally protected wetland conservation easement. The county has issued a mandatory demolition order. The Environmental Protection Agency has formally assessed fines of $10,000 a day for the ecological damage. Judge Eris's eyes widened as she read the EPA notice. She looked at Jaden with undisguised disgust. "You poisoned a protected watershed." "It was just some useless swamp water," Jaden bellowed, standing up from his chair, his fists clenched, his face purple with rage. "This is a setup. She's a manipulative, ungrateful little." "Sit down, Jaden," Judge Eris snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Jaden slowly sank back into his chair, breathing heavily. "And finally, Your Honor," Marcus said, saving the most devastating blow for last. "Regarding the $300,000 they claim to have invested from their life savings. Exhibit D." Marcus slid the private lending contract across the table. "The defendants did not use their savings," Marcus stated, the silence in the room now deafening. "They took out a high-interest predatory loan. And to secure that loan, they fraudulently used the business credentials and the tax identification number of their son, William. They have defaulted on the loan, meaning the private lender is currently seizing William's entire freelance business, his studio equipment, and his business accounts to cover his parents' debt." The young defense attorney closed his file folder. He physically pushed his chair away from Jaden and Delilah. He looked at Judge Eris. "Your Honor, as an officer of the court, I must request an immediate recess to confer with my firm regarding my continued representation of these clients." He was abandoning ship. But the climax of the room didn't belong to the lawyers. It belonged to William. William stood up. His hands were no longer shaking. The ghostly pallor had left his face, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve that I had never seen in him before. He looked at his parents, not with love, not with conflicted loyalty, but with absolute, total clarity. "William, honey," Delilah whimpered, reaching her hand out toward him. Tell them we were just trying to help you. We did this for you." "Do not speak to me," William said, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous room. "You didn't do this for me. You did this because you are selfish, greedy, and empty. You looked at my wife, a woman who supported me when I had nothing, a woman who was fighting for her life in a hospital bed, and you saw an opportunity to steal from her." "Son, you have to understand business," Jaden started to say, trying to use his booming, authoritative voice. "I said do not speak," William roared, slamming his hands down on the mahogany table so hard it rattled the water glasses. Jaden flinched, shrinking back into his chair. William reached into his own jacket pocket and pulled out a flash drive, tossing it onto the table in front of the mediator. "Your Honor, that drive contains every email, every text message, and every voicemail my parents sent me over the last 3 months, demanding I cover for them, demanding I lie to my wife, and outlining their intent to hide the construction from her. It also contains the financial records proving I had no knowledge of the loan they took out in my name." He turned back to his parents. "You thought you could use my love for you as a weapon against my wife. You thought I would just blindly protect you forever. But you broke it. You broke all of it. I am pressing full criminal charges for the identity theft and the fraudulent loan. I am cooperating fully with the district attorney regarding your forged deeds. As of this moment, I have no parents." William turned to me. His eyes were filled with tears, but his posture was straight. He didn't ask for forgiveness in that moment. He knew he hadn't earned it yet, but he offered me a nod of profound respect. He turned on his heel and walked out of the conference room, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him, sealing his parents' fate. Jaden sat frozen, his mouth open, his entire pompous world shattered. Delilah wailed, burying her face in her hands, her designer bag slipping from her grasp and hitting the floor. The illusion was gone. They were entirely, spectacularly destroyed, entirely by their own hands. The downfall of Jaden and Delilah was not just swift, it was absolute. With their own attorney dropping them and the mountain of irrefutable evidence Marcus had submitted, they didn't stand a chance in court. Within a week of the mediation, the district attorney formally indicted both of them on multiple counts of forgery, fraud, and identity theft. Because they had crossed state lines to secure the fraudulent notary, the charges carried severe mandatory minimums. Financially, they were ruined before the trial even began. The private lender seized everything they owned to cover the defaulted loan they had fraudulently taken out in William's name. Their suburban home, the expensive patio furniture Delilah obsessed over, Jaden's luxury cars, all of it was liquidated. They were forced to move into a tiny, dilapidated, one-bedroom rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. The social exile was perhaps the most painful part for Delilah. The details of their crimes became public record. They were immediately expelled from their country club. Their friends stopped returning their calls. They became pariahs, known only as the entitled in-laws who tried to rob their sick daughter-in-law and ruin their own son in the process. The EPA did not show them any mercy, either. The daily fines had accumulated to a staggering amount. As part of their plea deal to avoid maximum prison time, Jaden and Delilah were forced to surrender the last of their liquidated assets to pay for the ecological remediation of my land. It took 3 months, but using my professional network of land surveyors and environmental contractors, we systematically undid the damage. I hired a specialized demolition crew to come in and jackhammer the illegal concrete foundation into dust. We carefully removed the debris, brought in fresh, nutrient-rich topsoil, and began the slow, beautiful process of replanting native flora, restoring the wetlands to the sanctuary my grandfather had intended. Through it all, William and I navigated a complex, painful path toward de-healing. I hadn't immediately taken him back. He had moved into a small apartment of his own while I recovered in hours. We started intense couples counseling, and more importantly, he started individual therapy to dismantle the decades of manipulation he had endured from his parents. It was a long road. He had to take full responsibility for his cowardice, for lying to me, and for allowing his parents to violate my boundaries for so long. But the man who emerged from that therapy was not the passive, easily swayed boy I had married. He was grounded, fiercely protective, and deeply remorseful. The day he stood up in that mediation room and chose me over his abusers was the foundation upon which we slowly began to rebuild our marriage. Forgiveness wasn't a single event. It was a daily choice, and as I watched him work tirelessly to rebuild his freelance business from the ground up without taking a single dime from me, I knew we were going to make it. A year after the fever had broken, I stood in the middle of the eastern clearing on my 50 acres. The air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. The ugly, gray scar of the concrete foundation was completely gone, replaced by vibrant green saplings and the gentle sound of the restored creek flowing into the private lake. William walked up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, resting his chin softly on my shoulder. We stood in comfortable silence, watching a pair of hawks circle high above the tree line. I took a deep, clear breath, my lungs fully healed, my heart finally at peace. The land was safe. My boundaries were impenetrable. Justice had been fully served, and as I leaned back into my husband's embrace, I knew that the roots we were planting now would withstand any storm.